rules that made a lot of sense for hundreds of years make no sense overnight. I'll give you an example. And they're all over the place, but I'll use ones that maybe I've thought of before. One of my favorites is trademark law. Think about trademark law. Trademark law says that, in order to keep people from being confused about what they're buying, we allow owners, quote, owners of trademarks, which are people who sell goods or services under a particular brand, we allow those people to have exclusive rights in that brand. And so, for example, if I wanted to start selling sugared water, I can't call it Coca-Cola, because you, as a buying consumer, might say, oh, I know Coke, that's a good one, I'll buy it, I like the flavor of that, and you buy my not very good sugar water, and you were harmed. That's the whole concept there. And we created that system with a few very fundamental premises in it, like the idea that, well, you get that, but we don't want that to be overly powerful for brand owners, so we're going to restrict that geographically. So if I start Ed's Hamburgers in Austin, I'm the first to use it and I develop goodwill in that trademark. You can't start Ed's Hamburgers in Austin because people would be confused. But if you're in Bangor, Maine, or Anchorage, Alaska, and your name is Ed and you want to sell hamburgers, the system said that's fine, because no one in Bangor, Maine is going to walk into Ed's Hamburgers and think, oh, that's Ed's from Austin, right? It's a different geography. Well, imagine that system, which was honed over many years with lots of courts and developing a system of geographic protection for trademark, and then put goods and services and commerce on the internet, right? Where overnight the geographic contours of trademark law didn't work anymore. Because if I sold anything on the internet, I was basically making it for sale, not just all over the US, but really all over the world. And all of a sudden, you have a fundamental kind of construct in trademark law crumbled because we created an instant, easy way for people to conduct commerce at the same moment all over the US. That's an example of how laws that develop with a certain set of assumptions about how things work, can get kind of just turn on their head overnight by a technological development like the internet. And we saw that, at various ways with internet law, and we're still dealing with the ramifications of that. What I want to talk about tonight, because of all as fascinating as that is, and we talk about that a lot, and I talk about that a lot, is how we're seeing a very similar thing happen with this new technology, which is facilitated by the internet, but is layered upon it at the application level, which are these virtual environments where people are interacting, particularly with MMOs or multiplayer games. I'm not going to, normally when I do this presentation, spend a decent amount of time explaining the phenomenon of an MMO, what it is, how it works, but my gut tells me that I don't need to do that in this room. So I'm going to skip that, but if you're totally new to that world and don't have any clue what we're talking about, ask a question. The rest of the gamer geeks in this room probably fill you in. But why do I think that MMOs challenge basic premises of law the way the internet did and other kind of mass communication systems have done, and maybe even more so? Well, a couple of reasons. One is, the goal, it seems to me, as an outsider to the game industry, I advise lots of game companies, but I'm not in the game industry, is to create MMOs that have certain characteristics that really draw people into a level of engagement that they can monetize very heavily, right? And so if you think about what makes a successful virtual world, it turns out that the same game design principles that make successful virtual worlds, they're all the same, and they all, in one way or another, involve simulating non-virtual worlds. Okay? The more facets of the non-virtual, the real world, and I say that recognizing that's kind of begs the question, but the real world that you can insert into a game environment, the more compelling the game environment is for the players. Okay, they learn that quickly, and from persistence being one of them, right? The idea that when you stop playing, the game keeps going, which, by the way, is what happens in the real world. When you stop interacting with people, they keep interacting. You go to sleep, the world doesn't pause, right? It keeps moving, right? Persistence is really important. Social interaction, hugely important. The idea of incorporating first chat and then later the ability to speak with other players, that's hugely important. The more we make virtual environments like the real world, the more engaging they are. Perhaps the most significant um, of those characteristics, though, that game developers have really understood for several years, is that one of the things that makes us, it's just hardwired into all of us as people, is the concept of possessions. You know this if you have a kid, because as much as you want your first kid's words to be, dada or mama, almost inevitably you'll hear, like some of my kids, the first word's mine, right? But they got the toy, you grab it, and they start screaming mine, right? Possession is a hugely human thing. We were born somehow hardwired with the idea that we can have things. And what does it mean to possess things? It's ultimately, use some legal mumbo jumbo, it's exclusivity, which means I can have it, and when I have it, you don't have it. We really like that as humans. Okay? And so, game developers for MMOs and virtual environments very quickly realize that if you can put the concept of possession into a game, people like the game more. If you can put the concept of exclusivity into games, people are more engaged in the game. And actually, from my outside perspective, if you add persistence, human interaction, subtitled sex, which is, and possession into your game, those are the things that make people want to play your game in a virtual environment, right? I can go flirt. There's stuff going on when I'm not there, which makes me want to go back all the time, and I can own things. Okay? Possessions in particular, though, introduce the beginning of all kinds of issues that have prompted me and certainly a whole bunch of other people to start looking at game environments very differently. Because as soon as you introduce exclusivity of possession into any kind of environment, you have in essence kind of put the spark that's necessary to begin creating economy. Human economy is, the idea of things having value, things being scarce, etc., goes hand in hand with possession. If there's no exclusive possession, things don't take on value, right? So if I can have the sword, but any one of you in the game can also push a button to create the sword as well, then the sword isn't valuable. Right? Not in the same way as it is if it's scarce, right? If I have the sword and you want the sword, you can't get it without achieving something or doing something. That's the beginning of economy. And as soon as you have economy in a virtual environment, we start finding that people start assigning value to things. And all of the same stuff that happened in human society a long time ago, when economies start happening in those environments. Barter, the idea of having to earn things, the idea of wanting other people's things, lusting for others. All of those things start up, and in well-designed virtual environments, and that's really in all of them now that are worth anything or that are engaging, people have stuff that they own. Okay, that's just part of the game. It's not fun without it. The more realistically you create the seeds of environment in those worlds, apparently the more addictive the games are to people and the more they play, and that's what the game developers want. So they develop very quickly economies within the games. And this isn't news to you, although it's news to many of the groups I speak to. Those economies, like any other economies, that are sufficiently developed, start mapping to outside game economies. And so we all know, I presume you know, if you don't, I'm going to blow your mind with the idea that in any sufficiently advanced virtual game world that has scarcity and has economy built in, virtual items can now be mapped to real world value. And so if you're, a Warcraft player, or you're in Second Life, or take your pick of, I use really dated examples. I'm not even up on the newest MMOs that are out there, right? But in any of those environments, virtual goods, now there's either a rough equivocation to outside game value, or in the case of some of the more advanced popular games, there's real direct, we know the market value of a sword in World of Warcraft by going on eBay or going on the exchanges, etc. And in order to make their economies even more sufficiently engaging, they quickly, imported the concept of currency into the games, right? And so they're Warcraft gold, just like there's US dollars. And in fact, if you look at those currencies and the value of those items, they're very much function exactly the way real currency works. And there's nothing valuable about a dollar bill inherently. It's just a piece of paper. It shouldn't have a dollar worth of value, but for the fact that we've created a system that honors it having value. And the same is true with gold in an online environment. It's a proxy for value only because it can be traded for things that are scarce. People will honor it, and there's a social construct that's created in the case of one of these worlds by the game developers who said, look, gold's going to be used to buy things and sell things and create a value. So we've got these interesting characteristics in virtual worlds that look very much like what's going on in the real world. That's the backdrop for this discussion. So what I think intrigues lawyers, I think there's a lot that intrigues economists about that. I represent a couple of early virtual game companies and was amazed that one of the first big hires as they got bigger, one of them sold this thing that as they were getting to that level, there's a lot of money in the system, one of the big hires was an economist, which I thought was really amazing because they had to worry about the value of their currency. Nerfing, how nerfing might affect the value. Everyone knows what nerfing is. There's weapons that got too good, they had too much power, so maybe you back them off, but so they're not as good anymore, nerf them so they're less potent. But in fact, there's real concerns about how that affects the currency in the game. People used to pay a lot for that sword. If you nerf it, does it cause currency to devalue? And crazy issues that only economists seem to understand. So there's a lot to talk about on the economic side. But what about the law side? Well, there are a couple things, and I'll just start with some of the easy ones, but I think as we go through this, we can get even more advanced, and this is where I'd like you guys to get involved. What about the law side? Well, I think at the most fundamental level, there's an interesting question about when things in virtual worlds have a direct mapping to real world value, when a sword in Warcraft is worth 20 bucks on eBay, right? How we treat the legal right of possession of that item in a virtual world. Okay? It clearly is, the fact that it's in-game changes something. I think that's one of the open questions for this discussion of what that changes. But it's clearly valuable. The sword that is worth 20 bucks on an eBay exchange, that people will pay 20 bucks for on eBay, that's a virtual sword, has value. And so the question starts becoming, what happens with the very basic rules that we have in the outside world when activities happen in-game that have direct impact on people's pocketbook, okay? So we know that if I have a $20 thing here, I don't know what, calculator, $20 calculator, and I put it on this table, and you walk up and take it, that's a crime. That's not controversial. No one argues it's not. You took it, it was mine, it's theft, right? You can't do that. We also know that if you swindle me out of my $20 calculator, that's also actionable. It's fraud, right? You tell me, this, I don't know, whatever. You make up some lie, I rely upon it, and you take my. Those are actionable. The legal system steps in and punishes those activities because you've stolen from me or cheated me out of those possessions. So question number one is, if in fact a virtual item in a virtual world has real world monetary value, which I think we all know they do those same types of rules apply when you either take those items from me in a virtual environment or cheat me out of those items by tricking me or swindling me or defrauding me? And if not, because I think a lot of people's gut instinct is no, those rules shouldn't apply. You shouldn't go to jail for stealing someone's sword in Warcraft. The question is why not? And I don't think it's a trivial question. I think it's actually a profound question for us to determine what it is that makes that situation different. So first question for the group, if in fact, and put aside any particular game rules, because that's not unimportant, but let's put it aside for a minute. Let's say we have a virtual environment where you can possess virtual goods that we know have real world value, have an exchange rate you can track, and we all know are valuable in the outside world. And in the game, my character, quote, steals the item from you. Should you be able to file a police report? Yeah.
So, full disclosure, I used to work for Blizzard, and I worked for 5 years on World of Warcraft, so
Right.
it's something I thought about a lot.
Great.
You kind of can't put the rules aside. So,
I
in
agree.
Second Life, Linden dollars, you can buy Linden dollars for money. You're purchasing the Linden dollars from the company to use in the game. With World of Warcraft, the monetary value of the items is not something that you deal with Blizzard. Blizzard says these items are not worth real world money, and these items are virtual items and they're on our server. So in the case of the Linden dollar, I would agree that it is that, because you have specifically paid money for the service of having this gold in this game. But in the case of World of Warcraft, what you're actually paying for when you buy a sword or a character or money, you're paying for the time that it would take you to get that stuff. And you've decided that it's worth X amount of money not to have to spend X amount of time to grind those items.
So I agree with everything you're saying. I think that is certainly the position that, and in fact, the predominant number, I had a student of mine last semester did a survey of all terms of use for all the major MMOs, right? And by far and away, the Linden model is the vast minority. Most, in fact, I've drafted terms of use for online worlds, and the state-of-the-art lawyer tells you to tell your users they don't own anything, right? And that makes everyone at the game company feel good about, hey, we don't have this problem, because it is a real problem for them otherwise, right?
It still is a problem.
Yeah, it's still a problem, but it's still a problem. Because at the end of the day, right, I don't care what you said in your terms of use, if you're Blizzard, and I don't mean to pick on Blizzard, but if you're anyone, and you decide, you know what, everyone who worked really hard, either worked really hard and ground it out and, grinded it out and got that sword, or paid a bunch of money for currency to buy that sword, let's just take it away tomorrow, right? No one would be comforted by the fact that you said, but don't worry, it's okay, we just took it away from you, but the terms of use say we can do that. People would actually be bummed out. I mean, and rightfully so, they feel deprived. And so while I agree with you that there's you can't take the game rules out of the equation, and I'm gonna articulate in a second, I think, the lawyer's reason why that's true. The reality is, from a human perspective, people feel like they've lost something if they lose their virtual goods that they either put sweat equity into to build and acquire, or they paid good hard American dollars. From their perspective, it's just like buying anything at Walmart, right?
And to really quick, because
this
is your presentation, and it's not that companies like Blizzard or whatever, I don't work there anymore, so I don't speak for Blizzard. It's not that they don't care, but as far as calling the police, and you call, say, Blizzard, and I used to sit next to a guy, and he was kind of an auditor, and his job was to track down where the money went when accounts were hacked, and all of the assets were liquidated and the gold sent to another account, and it would be laundered essentially so that it could then be sold on eBay. And his job was to track. He would sit next to me, and his mantra was, "Where's the money, Lebowski?" And he would sit there and he would track where the gold went from account to account to account. It was his job. Blizzard paid him to do that, and the people involved in breaking into people's accounts and using cheating, to get stuff to sell for money, those accounts were punished to the best of their ability.
Which meant closing the account.
Yes.
Right. And so,
returning.
So let's just hypothetically take it out of a particular environment. But let's imagine that I'm really good at, and put aside even hacking, because I think that's but let's just say I'm really good at cheating people out of their virtual goods online. Maybe this is the scam. Let's make it easy to start with. I go to you and say, oh, you've got the sword of power? Great. I will give you $100 real US dollars for your sword of power. Right? And you're a sucker, and I ask you to agree to transfer it to me before I give you the $100 PayPal payment. You give it to me and I give you the $100. Real simple scenario. Shame on you for falling for the handing it over before I pay you, but let's just say that I did that. Do you have, what's your grievance for that? Clearly go to Blizzard or whoever it is and say, this guy, but first of all, I'm not convinced, I get it when they investigate hacking and moving money around in their system like they're not supposed to, but I'm not even sure what the response is from any of the big game companies about that activity. Do they say, sorry, you shouldn't have given the guy the sword?
Also, GM, and the reasoning why is not having to do with law. It has to do with, again, EULA against harassment, or the basic rules about don't be a jerk to other players.
So say you don't go to anti-self-disclosure, you say, you know, I don't want the EULA, I'm just gonna go to the cops, right? You told me you were gonna give me the $100, you didn't give me the $100, you got my sword, it's worth $100. Those are all undisputable facts. Why can't I go to the cops and say, hey, this guy cheated me out of something that's worth $100? What, or let me ask this a different way. Should I be able to do that?
Well, the cops just tell you to go civil anyway?
They might, I mean, but that's a different issue. I mean, I passed a link around an hour or two before this, if you were on the Meetup page. There's a proposal in the UK to actually have legislation on this issue, which got voted up a couple days ago. They call it the WOW crime bill. I love it, right? That, you know, somebody in their legal system has proposed that you would extend, you know, property crimes into these online environments, right? That's a different issue, whether they would enforce or not. But let's just take it out of that from, you know, from a practical question. Should they enforce? I mean, you know, my grandma decides to start playing in one of these environments and gets suckered by someone and loses $100, right? Has she been wrong, and should she have legal remedy for that outside of the game?
You have a specific scenario that you've introduced real world money immediately.
No, I didn't introduce it. It's there. Right?
I'm just saying. I mean, had it been in-game gold that you promised for the sword, might be a different scenario. Since there was real money offered, I think it seems pretty.
That's why I made the example like that. Yeah. But it doesn't take much, I think. Assuming that there's any corollary between real world.
You just have to find a law enforcement that's willing to.
Yeah, and I agree. But and the practical issue of whether they'll actually take it up or not is kind of irrelevant from the underlying issue of whether they should. Right. I mean, and you know, and I agree that I made it easy by putting real world dollars into it. But assuming what I said earlier, which is anytime there's scarcity in these environments, there's probably some corollary to real world value. You know, I don't think it changes the hypothetical much. That I promised you 100 gold, your character gave it to me, I reneged on the promise, ran off and said, you know, hey, I got your sword. You know, you're out $100 of value or whatever it is, whatever the exchange rate says it is. Just as if I'd stolen your calculator, right or wrong? I mean,
it's murkier, right?
Yeah, it's clearly murkier, right?
What if it's a felony amount of money?
Yeah.
$10,000.
What if it's $100,000?
Right. Second life and it's $100,000.
It's $100,000, and I swindled you out of it somehow, right? Or how about this? You know, I've got property in Second Life or one of these environments that lets you develop land, and I run a real estate scam. I start telling you, listen, you can make a lot of money. You pay me $1,000 for this acre in this virtual world. You know, it's guaranteed to be worth $5,000 6 months from now. Classic, securities fraud, right? I mean, what is clearly punishable. You can't make promises about those returns to people. I lie and say, oh, I know a buyer who will buy for 5x. You're going to guarantee to make your money. You give me the money in virtual or real money. I don't think it matters. And then it turned out to be a big scam. It's worthless. I knew that they were going to create 1,000 more parcels like that the next day, completely devaluing the purchase. Why? What is it about that transaction that makes us say, I don't know if that's legally actionable, versus what I think has the exact same economic impact if I did that with real land in the real world, where there's no question that's actionable. No question that law enforcement or SEC or someone or civilly would punish that action. Yeah.
Well, I think the game thing works against us in that sense, but I think to me the fundamental underlying problem is not what you're getting at. It's the fact that players don't understand what they actually bought in the game. They didn't buy anything but access to the game.
I'll respectfully disagree with you. I'll respectfully disagree with you. Yeah. And by the way, as lawyer to game companies, yeah. I think that's the mantra, right? We want them to believe that. I don't believe for a second when I go and buy a virtual sword for $50 that I'm thinking about it that way. And very, very, very few of the actual participants in the in-game economy think about it the way you want them to think about it for the game company, which is, well, you're buying access to the game. Bullshit, they're buying a virtual sword they think is worth $50.
Like people who run games are conflicted, right? They know that the strength of it is.
That's right.
Think about it.
In fact, I think they're complicit.
The way it actually is for them.
Oh, absolutely.
They want those items to become valuable. Remember what I started with is that's what makes the game compelling, right? In fact, if you too often repeat it to them, or let's put it this way, if you put the mantra you didn't really buy anything virtual into action too often, the game sucks. If you can take it to them willy-nilly, if you can devalue it, you nerf it, without people won't play anymore. They need it to have that same value. And I understand the game operator's perspective, which is they don't want to get embroiled in this problem, so I'll take them out for a minute. I'm not talking about whether you can sue EA or Blizzard or whoever it is, right? I'm talking about whether player to player there's an actionable thing there. So let me introduce a couple ideas, because I thought about this a lot, right? It's not a completely new problem, because in fact, we have lots of environments creating computers that are games that involve valuable things. Poker, for example, is one of them, right? And in fact, if you play poker at a casino, you can play with a made-up currency, the chip, which has no real value, except we all know it has value, right? And poker's an interesting example because there are things that you do when you play poker that would probably be actionable outside of the game, but are not actionable in the game. What's the best example? Bluffing. It's just a line. Hey, I've got a full house, better fold. Guy fold, I turned my cards over, I didn't have the full house. In the real world, that's fraud, right? I mean, Chris, what are the elements of fraud, right? An affirmative statement to someone that they rely upon to their detriment, right? Fraud, no question. But go try to prosecute someone for bluffing in poker. So, and rightfully so, I think. Well, I'll take money out of it, right? Imagine I'm walking down the street and a big 300-pound guy comes up and just grabs me and throws me to the ground. What's that legally? Right. Imagine I've got a football helmet on, I'm doing it at DKR, right? The same guy during the game grabs me and throws me to the ground, we applaud. We don't charge him with battery. Why? Why in poker can I bluff you without it being actionable? Why can I tackle you forcefully in football without it being battered?
It's a social contact.
Consent,
Yeah.
right? It's got to be some version of waiver. In game, I've waived my right to complain about those activities, which would otherwise, I think, be actionable. So in fact, being in game may mean, for this conversation, that when you play anything, you're adopting a different rule set than the real world. The rules, the predominant governing rules, like the law that we all live under, and you entered into this consent thing where you say, that would be fraud to lie to you to get your money in the real world. It would be battery to tackle you, but you waived those rights. We have lots of examples of that outside of MMOs. So the question is there some kind of broad waiver happening for people in MMOs to say, I know that I think this stuff has value, but in fact, I really waived my right to enforce its value. Yes?
Insofar as user agreements are, then yes, you do, because you have to click through it every time you log in, which is weak, and we understand no one reads it. But back to your original example about the start of an economy, yeah, you're absolutely right. But the thing about virtual worlds is that, yes, they're almost like the real life, except they're supposed to be fun. Economies are not fun except for people who like to play with spreadsheets all day. So there's an interest in the place of the people running the fun environment to make it as fun as possible. At the point when it becomes a job, it ceases to be fun. It actually becomes someone's job.
Yeah, it's a really fine line, right? Because the more real it is, I think, the more fun it is up to a point until you lose $20,000 in game value that actually has real world value. Then it sucks all of a sudden. Yeah.
We also have the third curve, that's the role of the referee. So in her case, her person the next play became the referee to make sure that was a well-run world.
Yeah.
In the case of football, the referee's making it, that's the enforcer. Now, when you've crossed over the line to the real world, which is involving real money, the real question you're asking is, will the police come? Will the courts?
Or look at slightly different, should they? I mean, I don't know.
Well, no, but I mean, it's still a valid ground to play on. You can't use, I don't think, you can use these games. Because if that same football player on the way down the tunnel is smacked,
it's battery.
The real.
Yeah, but here's the difference. So I've thought about this a lot. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And there's a huge difference, I think, between what's happening in MMOs what's happening in football or poker. Okay? First of all, read the EULAs. I write them, read them. They don't talk about this, except at an exceedingly abstract level where they just try to pretend like stuff doesn't have real value. They don't talk about what it means to cheat people out of their possession, whether when you have a battle with someone you can take the possession. I mean, they just don't get there. But if you read the rules of poker or the rules of football, and they're exceedingly developed on what is a fair hit, what's not a fair hit, what you can do. You can cheat in poker if you call cheating bluffing, and you can't cheat in poker by having a part of your sleeve, right? There's a hugely developed system that gives a lot of very particular guidance on what is fair play and unfair play. And so when I play poker, if I know the rules of poker, I think it's pretty clear that I've waived and consented. Go to Warcraft or any of these worlds and read the EULAs, and it doesn't talk about player-to-player interaction with anywhere near that level of detail. It just says don't expect to own anything.
Okay, but I want to ask then the game players, aren't you at least using social? You said one of the reasons you do a game is you have social networking abilities. So now I can exchange it back and forth, and I'd love to be back in a world of, I don't know, ancient Jerusalem or something, whatever it was, wherever that happened, where the caves, where everybody talked together and identified a person, and threw them out, or whatever.
So actually, I think that's what is actually partly going on, and one of the things where I normally take this talk and not go all the way there is, in fact, the EULAs are kind of irrelevant at, for understanding how people are working these issues online. What's happening instead is the players are creating social constructs of their own and social contracts of their own, and they shun one another, and they say that's no good. And if you cheat someone out of their gold in the wrong way, and in game by game, game environment by game environment, what that is different. You get enforcement not from the game operators, but from the other players who don't, instead of laws, we're getting mores and norms that are developing about
what. If the word got around that the World of Warcraft was like that, and if things were getting worse, that game's gone.
Or
and
it's more
up
fun.
to the game developer. No one will. What?
Most people want that.
Ultima Online, about 15 years ago, like that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
They had a big problem. They were one of the first massively multiplayer online games. They had a big problem with hacking and people stealing other people's in-game gold and.
And hacking feels different, by the way.
They lost
right?
a lot of players because they weren't rising to the challenge of how to stop it.
Yeah, I think hacking is the easiest case. I'm much more fascinated by activities that don't rise to the level of hacking and breaking the system, and manipulating access to steal someone's gold, but by stealing their gold through the interactions that the system clearly allows you to do, like defrauding them. Right?
Ultima Online, they had
cheat.
characters who were thieves.
Yeah. And by the way, there are games where you quite explicitly, that's the whole point, is to be a thief,
Yeah.
right? And so it's weird to say the thief in the game, even though the items that they can steal have real world value outside the game, it's weird to talk about those guys as being the same. I mean, it's the game. That's the whole point. It's like, it would be like saying, you're committing real estate fraud when you play Monopoly. It's like, no, I don't think, right?
Is there current precedent? Because really what we're speaking to is like a perceived loss of some type of value, or real mapping to real world value. What happens when the gaming company goes under? Let's say the game goes on and the server's lost. And
This is why the EULAs say what they say, right? Because the game companies are covering their butt for that scenario. That's not a hypothetical. It's actually happened a bunch. There are a bunch of environments that have just been turned off, and people.
Litigation and people trying to pursue that.
No, I think the contract there is pretty solid. I mean, I think that because then your action's against the game company, and that's the only party in that arena that you have an actual contract with. You don't have contracts with the other users. You have a contract with the game company. So your remedies and rights against your game company, I think, are pretty well defined by that contract. And they have a really good argument that you can't sue them for them turning the game off because it says what the game company wants to say, which is you didn't really own this to begin with. You're just paying for access and all that stuff. And so it's a less interesting question because although people still are pissed about it, and I think they feel aggrieved, it's not as clear that they have a legal remedy. I think it's more interesting when you're talking player to player, where no one signed anything about your rights vis-a-vis one another. I don't have an agreement with you.
I think that's part of the attraction of some of these.
I'm positive part of the attraction, not maybe
You
the
can have
attraction.
social interactions.
Without it, it's boring, right? And it's tic-tac-toe without it.
Another way to put it is MMOs are the only kind of games where someone else decides when you stop playing. It's very possible to do that. But the same thing is like AOL shutting down IM one day. They could totally do that. What would they do? Now granted, there's a lot more ways to instant message people than there were when it started, but just another perspective, just to point out how you're right. Cheating is a different kind of beast, but from my perspective and from a player's perspective, I would argue it's actually all part of the same thing. And I would just say that most of the hacking and cheating that's going on, most games don't have a hacking problem. They have what's an RMT problem, real money transactions. And that's like 90% of the operations coming from China, which are cottage industries, which are all about gaming the system, either getting a whole lot of virtual currency by repetitious action within the game, or more often, taking control of someone's account long enough to strip it of all its valuable items and currency and fare it off, as the lady behind me asked you. From the player's perspective, and all you need to do is have someone who's lazy, who doesn't want to play the game as it was intended to be played. They say, wow, I wish I had good gear, or I wish I had enough money to buy that good gear. If there's a website that has, real in-game currency for real-world cash transactions, they'll take it, not because they're bad, but because they're lazy. If there's someone in-game that will tell them about it, and most of the time that will happen anyway, from the player's perspective, that should just be as much a part of the game, which in my mind makes what you're trying to suggest, that the player's notion about what is valuable, totally irrelevant. The companies can't support that in any way possible. Players will make value assumptions about anything they want to, but ultimately it's got to be the person in charge of the game to make the ruling on what actually is valuable. Otherwise,
that's like saying the government determines the value of the chair you're sitting in.
Yeah, that's no.
No, they don't.
So
people who want to purchase that chair.
It's an amazingly, I followed you all the way to your conclusion, and I understand the argument completely. But then I take one step back from your conclusion, and you're telling me that Blizzard or NCSoft or whoever it is now taking this role, which I don't think we've ever ceded to a private entity. You got millions of people interacting with millions of dollars worth of value, and we're saying they're in charge. NCSoft's in charge because it happens to be happening in their game environment. They can determine that's real value or not real value. They can take it at will. We don't even give our own government that power, right? We have protections against that. I mean, the U.S. government can take your land under eminent domain or something, but at least there's some semblance of protections against that with due process and other things. It's kind of amazing to me for us to cede that over to these people who created these environments. I get it, they run it, they own it, they created it, they wrote these contracts, but are we really willing to entrust game companies with that level of power?
Well, it's private property, isn't it?
Yeah. What power?
So
in what sense?
Are we ceding stuff?
My grandma who's playing the game, and that doesn't happen by the way, but I like that example, is not thinking about being on someone's private property. She's sitting in her living room on a screen trying to earn the $50 sword and puts her hard work into it or actually uses her social security check to get it. If someone takes it, she's aggrieved, I think, just as real as if someone
But
took
if I
it.
walk onto your land and I just don't think it's your land, it doesn't mean shit.
She has recourse.
All that mattars is it private property?
What
or
is her
not?
recourse?
Go to CNN or HL. Nancy Grace loves it.
I think that part of the problem is that as someone who worked in the industry, and I'm not the only one
Yeah.
here, is that we're having trouble detaching ourselves from the perspective of the developer, the publisher.
Right.
And this is a bigger issue than just what does Blizzard do about it. I think that such a lady would definitely should have some kind of recourse. They can go to the claims court, or I think that there should be some kind of recourse, because just like when the guy tried to sell the Eiffel Tower, he didn't own the Eiffel Tower, but he sold it to 5 different people as scrap metal anyway. It's kind of the same thing as that. And there have been other private
The fact that the
companies.
game companies can say, hey, there's a contract that says, it doesn't mean that grandma didn't take a real loss.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that
And I
the
don't,
crime has occurred.
and boy, again, I think you're exactly right. I think it's really easy to conflate the game company's interests in all this, but the millions and millions and millions of users are not thinking about their world vis-a-vis what the EULA says about it. They're thinking about it, how it affects their pocketbook, and it does them no good to say, don't worry, you didn't lose your $500 sword because you never owned it to begin with. They're like, yeah, but I paid $500 for it yesterday. Sure felt like I owned it, right? And I don't care what your EULA says about it, which I've never read. What I know is I'm out $500. That guy cheated me out of that, and I didn't agree to that. I don't remember signing saying you can take my sword. And so the question is, do we give these people remedies on it? Wipe this whole issue aside. The government's going to wake up to all of this. It's just starting. It's shocking that it's taking this long. But there's a bunch of stuff happening with game environments where value is concerned that they traditionally regulate, and I think they're going to want to start regulating. So for example, if there's $100,000, take a big number because it's easier to get our arms around, $100,000 transaction in a game, and I buy this $100,000 piece of property, and then I turn around and sell it to another guy for $300,000 worth of game currency, I should be talking to the IRS about my gain there, right? It's a real gain. It's $200,000 worth of real gain. And right now, there's not even a semblance of how to deal with that issue from a tax perspective. But the government will eventually care, right? And so I think you're going to have some very interesting questions about people having to report in-game value gains on their taxes.
This year that virtual currency.
Virtual currency, right?
Property is taxable as property.
It's taxable property, and it came up in the context of Bitcoin, but there's I think it's pretty clear that it's not restricted at all. And so no one's doing it. I've never heard of anyone actually doing it. But if you make money in an online game environment, you probably have tax reporting obligations.
You have an app.
Which, by the way, underlies my whole point of it's property, whether the EULA says so or not. The IRS is going to say it is, and I don't care. I don't think you can hold the EULA up to fight the government.
It's also a source of money for the government. You have, of course, the analog is the lottery.
Of course,
and it was done between
another
years and somebody got built. They said that a person lost their life savings on this lottery. You did it. And they said, but we know people love lottery, and we are nice for people. We're a service for them. We'll do a lottery, and you will take some piece. Now, we give it to education, so you won't really care, which I don't know whether that's followed anymore, but that's how I remember that whole transfer.
Here's another example where the government, I think, will care, right? If I go online and set up a casino in the in-game environment and take house odds, right? They care when the company does it, right? Clearly, and we know that. We've seen them come. But we haven't seen them yet where if a player does it, player to player, for virtual currency, right? And I say, hey, I'm just setting up Ed's Casino. You want to sit down and play poker at our virtual table, great, but the house takes its bit, right? And it's all fake money anyway, and the EULA says it's not real. I could get rich running that virtual casino, and as far as I know, no one's ever gotten in trouble for doing that to the extent the game environment's facilitated.
There was a period of time in World of Warcraft where individual players were running casinos. They would do there's a random number generator in the game, and they would start a group and everyone would pay a certain amount of money, and then they would do a random number generation, and whoever got closest to the number won. And that was eventually outlawed by because they were spamming large populated areas, and so the activity was outlawed by the company.
Was it illegal for them to do that? It'd be illegal to do that outside the game, for sure.
How big was the church?
Yeah. We have a question from a viewer on the live stream. Donna asks, she was asked a question about property first. How, if at all, property is defined by these, she says contracts, but like the terms of
so the traditional best practice for the EULAs is to claim that in-game property is not in fact property. And they set up that concept. I think it's primarily based on protection for the game companies, right? That's really important for their exposure to say, just because you can get a sword in the game doesn't mean you own anything. There's, I think, interesting question over whether that defines your rights vis-a-vis other users or not about that. You know, if you were to sue the game company over your lost possessions, I think you lose because you've got an enforceable agreement with that.
And so she asked a related question. Do players of these games have anything like tenants' rights, like you would if you were renting an apartment, and are game companies essentially landlords?
I think I think this is exactly the kind of question that you start asking when the legal precedent that we have isn't finely tuned for these environments. I mean, I think the answer is no, probably technically, but the more important question is, should they have something like that, right? Should you have certain rights, that are mandated by statute, regardless of, you can say whatever you want in a lease with somebody if you're a landlord, but the law overrides that freedom to contract at a certain level, so that you can't just put them out, immediately. You have to give them, and the question is, should we have similar laws governing game environments to protect people's rights in those environments as well?
Certainly the users have the collective power, if they're organized, to bargain with the operators of the platforms that they're using, whether it's the virtual world or Facebook or some major social media, and to sort of start acting up about what the governance regimes are.
And they do. And there's plenty of examples of that actually happening.
More often they just quit.
Yeah, that was the case with
That's
Spotify. They
it.
lost a huge portion of their user base because they refused to address it, and people just voted with their feet.
There's enough competition now you can do that.
So I find that fascinating too. In fact, like I said, another part of this talk, which I'm not going to do as much here, is, and I think there's a tremendous need for someone to start studying, not just EULAs, which is easy, but really trying to ascertain the underlying social contracts of these environments, because they're different, right? In some places, certain things are okay. In other places, in other online games, it's just developed organically that they're not. And if you get philosophical about it, I think what we're seeing, maybe for the first time in history, is it's like a big social laboratory of a type we've never seen before. The idea of creating new rule sets for governance prior to this technological development involved having to start a country and compose, you get a king out and then you sit down and say, let's write a new constitution. And that just didn't happen that often. I mean, literally, a few handfuls of time over many years, every once in a while, a new country springs up with and they start from scratch with an economic system, a new constitution, et cetera. But there's a pretty interesting thing happening in these online games where as soon as they launch, the users start creating social contract, immediately. And I think they develop in pretty nuanced systems. And then you can vote with your feet in a way that citizens of a sovereign nation are much less empowered to do. And so as soon as that system's not working for you, you just quit and go play somewhere else. And so it seems that if someone's studying this in a sophisticated way, we're probably watching some correlation between game popularity and sophisticated social constructs in those games that treat players fairly, right? There's probably a correlation. You say, you know why this game works and that one doesn't? Because the rules, not just the EULA, forget the EULA, the rules of interaction that the community has formed make it a fair and good place for the players, and others aren't as good, and so people don't play there. And so we're watching people, and by the way, many of them are kids, which is also fascinating, create social construct at a rapid pace that we've never seen before, ever. I mean, maybe they stumble on a system that works better, not just in game, but actually is instructive to how we should be running not just the game environment, but the outside the game environments, because they're trying a lot of stuff that we don't try normally.
They might be ready when you as a lawyer, as most lawyers, as many lawyers do, turn into legislators.
Yeah.
Use that as the simulation.
I won't do that.
So you started out saying because we have laws that we have this system that, right?
Yeah.
Tested the laws in virtual environment.
Now we have a system to use a simulation.
There's a guy named John Rawls, a philosopher, Harvard philosopher, who's written, that if you haven't read, his seminal work is, what's the name of it? On Justice, I think. Theories of Justice. Rawls, one of his tenets is, all of our legal constructs in the real world are screwed up, partly because the people that make the rules know where they are in society, right? And so you're entrusting people who know their own social place to create rules about how, and guess what? Those rules tend to favor the kind of people that are in position to make the rules, right? Rawls says that if you really want to know what real fair systems look like, you would have somehow, and unfortunately when he wrote it in the 70s, it was a thought experiment, You'd have systems developed by people before they knew where they were going to be in society. You do it blind, like, the old justice is blind thing. You say, you get to create the rules, but you don't know whether you're going to be the poor guy or the rich guy, right? Or the criminal or the law enforcement guy. You create the rules blind. But if you could really do that, Rawls theorized, right, because it was just theory, we'd create really fair rules, because you'd hedge your bets. You'd be like, no, I'm not gonna just, tax the poor and give all these tax breaks to the rich, because I might be one of the poor. In fact, the odds are pretty high that I will be, right? So but we've never seen it in action. But I think what's happening in games is something close to that, or at least closer, because you get everything speeds up. So how geneticists study genetic mutation, they do it in fruit flies. Why? Because they grew really fast, right? You get multiple generations really fast, so you can actually trace mutations in a way that you couldn't if you were doing it in oak trees. It would take lifetimes to do. Social constructs in games are happening really fast with experiments, some failing, some working at a fast level, and maybe we can turn to what's going on there and say people are creating these things. They're starting the game and they immediately, the moment they get there, before they know if they're going to be powerful or not powerful, are helping define the rules for their own game. And as close to what Rawls talked about as I think we've ever seen. I don't think Rawls is dead now. We could have imagined that we might have, empirical data to look at for his theory.
So what you're saying is absolutely true, and I agree with it, but I would suggest that being a part of any particular game has less in common with citizenry, which I think you would agree with me is necessary for any laws to apply to a particular individual, depending on what, citizen of what country or state or whatever they're in. It has less, being in a game is more like existence itself. Real life is the game that we can't choose to stop playing and then start playing again, unless you believe in incarnation. If you stop playing a game, you get to continue living your own life and going somewhere else. So if you want to talk about the role and the power that a game company might have, they're less like a government, they're more like God. And they have to be. They created the whole world. And they created the whole universe that lived within it. So when you're talking about the social contract within it, yeah, when the game starts up, they may be populated by people who have played other games, but the games are going to be different. And the different makeup of the people around it are going to maybe potentially form a social contract based on the game environment that they're in at that moment. But again, that's not fun. What Professor Rawls was talking about, social contracts in the real world, we have to do that because we have to keep living. The opportunity to not do that is death.
Yeah, look, if the point is there's a difference between online games and the real world, I agree. No, but it's not a critical point. I think I conflated them a little bit. You're right, they're voluntary in a way that, the real world isn't. I've seen some 15-year-olds who would argue that it's the reverse, right? The game environment's mandatory, the real world's kind of the option. But don't forget too that it's easy to draw the distinctions you're drawing with the current technology set. But fast forward 150 years, right? Where the simulation is going to be so many orders of magnitude better that I think that some of these distinctions really are going to be hard to understand or see. It's not clear what it means anymore to have a real world relationship with versus virtual one and real world. These problems are not going to get easier. I think they're getting a lot harder.
You're basically your premise is we're on our way to being basically regulated Vegas. We have economies, we make money, not just make money, we actually make money for banks at some level. Everything is pointing to me like, that we're going to get up in a...
Well, I think that's an interim step.
Incredibly regulated.
I think this is coming. So yes, if you want my opinion, I think that you can step out, the 20, 30 year perspective, there will be a lot of folks who refer to this vastly unregulated environment as a golden age of virtual gaming and MMOs, right? Just like, by the way, I think there were lots of people in the West who used to they ran casinos without any government intervention. And I bet when that changed, they thought it really sucked, and they couldn't believe the government was coming in and, I have no doubt that MMOs as we know them today won't remain unregulated. There's too much real value going on. The game companies are forcing the technology along a path that guarantees that's going to happen. The better they make the game, the more they march towards regulation. The interesting question is whether or not that will last, or whether there'll be fuel, because I think enforcement in those environments is really difficult. Right? You can regulate a casino because you can go show up and enforce in a way that it's hard to understand how you regulate online.
Yeah, but the casinos are all electronic now anyway, and they're regulating the code. They're regulating the source code.
Yeah.
Not just the physical locations.
Well, that's what's going to happen.
So that's already here.
That's the Lessigian, and for those of you who know Larry Lessig, right? That's his big insight with his book Code and the Laws of Cyberspace, where he predicted accurately that once you lose the ability to regulate activities of people in a virtual environment, the easier way to regulate them for government, the shortcut way, is to regulate the code, because the code has more control of their activities than the law does, right? That's what DRM is in the copyright world, and that's what encryption is, right? They're more effective ways of regulating activity, and I think that's coming too. I think that we're not far from a day before you launch a virtual game, the government's going to vet your code, and maybe say, we're not going to allow you. Oh yeah, it allows for casino activity. No, that part of the code's out. It allows for real estate speculation. No, not unless you register with the government.
We can't have any innovation. That would be unregulated.
And by the way, I'm not advocating that's the right thing. I think it's the inevitable thing.
Yeah, I guess.
I don't see how it's not. Yeah.
Can't we just, I would see like the first step would be the government starts enforcing existing laws, right? Because obviously in your scenario where you paid real world money for a virtual item, like that could be enforced by the government today. Like we don't need new laws to enforce that as theft, I would say. So if there's real currency exchange.
Well, we might, because it's not so much whether it looks like an offense on its face, it's the defenses that come up. Because you try to put me in jail for my thief character in an online game stealing something, and I think I've got a defense.
Well, in that case, though, that's clearly, if you're playing with the rules state that you're a thief. That's a different thing than me committing fraud in an online environment, right? Like the frameworks already exist that prosecute fraud. If it's clearly fraud, it could be prosecuted today. Like if it's like.
It's amazing how we've gotten there, by the way, because when I started, I think my proposal was that was something to be prosecuted. No one seemed to agree with that. But as you have these conversations, everyone starts going, clear fraud in game, right? But that's not a non-controversial statement, that if my game character cheats your game character out of virtual gold, that should be prosecuted.
I'm not saying it should or shouldn't. I'm just saying it could be defined by our current laws if it's not clearly a part of the gameplay. If
our current laws,
fraud is not your gameplay,
Yeah.
if your bluffing is not part of the gameplay and stealing from you is not part of the gameplay,
Yeah.
then I could see the government prosecuting you under existing laws because those laws against fraud already exist.
But eventually it'll go to the Supreme Court. Will they understand any of this stuff?
Would it even be that? Because what if the game that's being made is being created by someone in Korea or Malaysia or Iceland?
Well, that's where what if it was the person who committed fraud isn't in the country where they want to prosecute? Right? Or
if it was going to be
the game is hosted in that country.
Another difference in what I would see that would really reduce law enforcement's desire to try to police this is that in real world there's evidence and it's easy to uncover evidence, but in a virtual world, the game operator could destroy the evidence.
Unless it's illegal to do that.
Right, yes, yeah.
It's illegal.
But
Or they're legislated to put back doors.
Which, by the way, they're apparently now doing quite a bit of.
They log everything.
That's the one.
And the NSA was watching Warcraft, right? We know that.
But is there any precedent to require MMO to keep this data?
Actually, I think there is, just for user data.
No, only for financial data.
Yeah.
Certain countries, certain
In-game,
Personally identifying what those are. Yeah, it's pretty scary.
There's certainly precedent of MMOs kicking off people who are trying to reveal, corruption in the economy or whatever. So they have suppressed, evidence before.
Well,
At least suppressed whistleblowers. Like Ultima, or not Ultima, like Sins Online was one example that Henry Jenkins mentions in the Divergence question.
Yeah.
There's a professor who's trying to reveal stuff going on in the online economy, and they just kicked them off.
They happened in Ultima too, because people were showing how to duplicate gold, and they kicked people out of the game for trying to tell other players how to duplicate gold.
Let me suggest that the feeling of dread that you may have if you're invested in this world is a recognition that we're at the end of an unregulated golden age. That I think that it's really hard to imagine we're not going to pop out of quick soon. I think, and by the way, that was the net too. For those of you who are young, and not remember, we felt that way too in 1989 and 90. Like, hey, this is totally unregulated. This is awesome. You guys for
On the subject of the social contract of within the game rules, I love to play rogues, and it's easily been 20 years since I've been able to actually steal something out of another player's inventory. Back in the days of like text mods, you were playing a rogue, you could actually pickpocket another player, or you could kill a player and take all of their stuff. But nowadays, playing a rogue on an MMO like World of Warcraft, even if you steal from the NPCs, that doesn't take it out of the pocket that everybody else draws from when the item is, when the monster is killed. And there has been kind of, and I was kind of wondering what it was all about, and I think you've answered the question for me. There's kind of a trend in massively multiplayer games like GTA 5 Online. You can't trade things. World of Warcraft came up with soul-bound items, something that's yours, and you can't give it to someone at all. Once you pick it up, it's in your inventory until you destroy it. And in GTA 5, you can't give anybody else money, you can't trade cars, you can't trade clothes.
I love that they call them soul-bound items, right? Because that's, if God were to create such a thing, he'd probably call it that too.
Yeah. And I think it because, and it might be a response to what you're talking about, I think you're very much correct, but it's also, it's not fun to be stolen from. It's not fun to lose your things.
Which is amazingly, coincidentally true in the real world too, by the way.
Even if it's part of gameplay. I mean, a lot of the, if there was a MUD that allowed you to kill other players, and this is back in 1990 when I was in college, if there was a MUD that allowed you to kill other players and take their stuff, it was specifically called a PK MUD in the name.
What was it, PK?
Player killer. And there, if you look at stories like .hack, which takes place in a massively multiplayer world, there is one specific dude who is a dude everybody hates, he's super annoying, and they call him PK or they call him player killer, and it's a defining feature of his personality and his identity as a person, that he is a PK. And these people, there are player versus player servers now, and player versus environment servers. And player versus player violence is very stringently controlled in a lot of online games. And even if you succeed and you prevail and you kill the other guy, because man is the most dangerous game and the most intriguing prey, you still can't just take their stuff the way that you can take an NPC, a mob stuff.
So there are interesting variations on that. So for example, I played a lot of Minecraft, and it's not an MMO. It's not that massive, right? It's much smaller. It doesn't have millions of players. Like the biggest servers, there are people setting up networks with maybe 1,000 players. But there are certain setups where that is a gameplay style, where it's factions fighting against each other, trying to kill other players and steal their stuff. The difference in Minecraft is they're not super rare unique items. Right. So in an MMO, you might have something you have to grind for many hours to find or get or buy. Whereas in Minecraft, you have to mine for an hour.
Or you can just go into creative mode.
Well, not in the servers. but like it's not like the kind of thing where you have this thing where you've invested a lot of time or money. You've invested a much smaller investment into getting those items.
So another fun thing someone pointed out to me, and I think this is probably worth thinking about, is that the controls you're talking about, in the game architecture, a lot of that's still being driven by the traditional hardcore gamers right now, right? And so they hate the PKs, right? There's a term I had to term for, I love that term, right? Because it violates their ethos, right? It's not fun, as you said, but hate to burst the bubble, but the masses haven't shown up yet, right? Go down to the hotel bar, how many of those people are active gamers, right? They're not, but they will be. I think that that's inevitable, and I don't think they bring those same ethos in. It may be a lot more fun to them to play games where you can take stuff, right? And so another way we may be in a golden age still, is we're in that weird place where the gamers who are still traditional hardcore gamers who've kind of grown up in the system, and I'm not one of them, but I know that they exist, it sounds like you're one, still have ability to influence game environments to match their traditional ethos, because if the gamers don't show up, the game doesn't work, right? But that's just because the masses haven't caught on. When the masses catch on, they're not going to care. That's like the old classic rock guys saying this new music sucks, right? Except Miley Cyrus is outperforming the old classic rock stuff, right? And objectively to me, that's trash, and Led Zeppelin's not, right? But you can't deny what's going on there, which is, there are a hell of a lot more Miley Cyrus fans now, and she's making a lot more money than there are Zeppelin fans, right? Because in fact, we can't, so we may still be, and this isn't my idea, I've heard someone articulate this, no, it's still working because the masses haven't shown up to ruin it. Yeah, that may be another golden age.
This is what's happening in the games now, is it's actually moving away from the PvP stealing environments to a more masses-friendly environment where you can't steal, like GTA 5. Because the masses don't like that. They don't like to have to grind for stuff, whereas the hardcore players...
Or this wave of masses don't, but wait till the businessmen and others get in, right?
Well, there's a story on NPR about Minecraft crossing. You're saying only a few. They're saying it's got all the qualities of being mass.
That was just one example.
Yeah, no,
all games are doing this. All games, all MMOs. I mean, World of Warcraft is an obvious example where they've moved and changed features and, I won't say dumb it down, but, made it more appealing to the masses who aren't the hardcore players. And stealing in PvP is one of those things that I think appeals to the hardcore player more than the masses. So you're seeing that mechanic being removed from our games, which raises more legal issues.
Sure.
That PK became also spreading out, dispersing.
I mean, the real challenge has always been that while the worlds are virtual, the emotions are real.
They're real people playing them.
Yeah. No, but you're as emotionally invested in an online relationship as you are as a real one. You're as emotionally invested in your stuff in an online environment as you are your real stuff. When your stuff gets stolen, it's just like your house getting stolen.
I agree. I think that I don't think that should be even surprising. Hell, I can get emotionally attached to owning Park Place when I play Monopoly.
So does a novel.
I agree. That's a really simple, not very deep, not very interactive game, right? But if I can be bummed out when I don't land on the blue properties of Monopoly, I'm absolutely convinced in an immersive, persistent environment like an online game, that feeling is multiplied exponentially, and the better the game is, the better tech and the better the simulation is, the more I'll feel that way, to the point where it does me no comfort at all to say you just lost a game piece as opposed to you lost your phone.
And all the degrees of freedom that's been reduced over the last 20 years have been in a direct response to get more players to come and to stay.
Yeah.
So all the degrees of freedom that the small buds had
didn't
work at scale. They don't work at scale. They don't work with anonymity or pseudo-anonymity of players at all, because a lot of people want to be the outlaw. And they want to try stuff that they can never try in real life. And when you're trying it with real people, you get real consequences.
Yeah. All right, well, I'll leave it at that. Thanks, guys, it was